In the emergency boardroom, with a federal client threatening to cancel a $180 million contract, I refused to sign. I'm Iris Lane, Director of Contract Risk Oversight, the only executive authorized to issue a compliance certification during a federal review. And the document in front of me contained a payment acceleration clause that could violate procurement regulations. Finance wanted it signed. Sales wanted it closed. The client was on speaker, asking for confirmation. All that stood between projected revenue and regulatory exposure was my signature. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from today? And what's the temperature like where you are if you're still here with me? Please press the subscribe button. Your work is really important. Just then, a voice rang out. Iris. Graham Whitmore said sharply, fingers drumming against the glass table. We are not losing this deal over technical hesitation. Graham was 42, newly appointed CEO, polished MBA. Famous for repeating one phrase, speed is strategy. He believed process was optional if revenue was urgent. This isn't hesitation. I replied evenly, it's non-compliance. A few executives avoided eye contact. Legal shifted uncomfortably, but stayed silent. Graham leaned forward. You don't get to slow down revenue because you're nervous. I didn't raise my voice. I'm not nervous. I'm compliant. The room froze. The federal client's line crackled in the background. Graham straightened his tie, then delivered the decision like it had been rehearsed. You're overstepping operational authority. He glanced toward HR. Terminate her access. Effective immediately. My phone vibrated. Badge disabled. Email suspended. 14 years of building audit-proof safeguards reduced to a system notification. He wasn't finished. We don't need gatekeepers, he said, scanning the room. We need closers. No one defended me. No one objected. I gathered my folder and walked out while the client was still waiting. At the end of the hallway, I looked back through the conference room glass. Graham had moved into my seat, and he was signing the certification I refused to touch. I have a small note. Some parts of this story are dramatized and embellished by artificial intelligence to highlight ideas and enhance emotional impact. However, the core message remains very real. I hope that something in this story will resonate with you, perhaps a memory, an emotion, or a lesson you have personally experienced. By the next morning, Whitmore had already rewritten the narrative. An internal email hit every inbox. We are streamlining compliance redundancies. Redundancies. That was the word he chose to summarize 14 years of building a risk control framework that kept this company out of 3 separate federal investigations. I read it twice, partly to confirm it was real, partly to measure how disposable integrity had just become. There was no mention of the $90 million contract I once refused to sign because it lacked mandatory data protection language. 6 months later, a competitor paid $27 million in penalties for the exact same oversight. Our board had called my decision prudent leadership back then. Now I was legacy friction. Whitmore didn't waste time. He announced that the interim CFO would assume certification authority for operational continuity. The problem was simple. The CFO was not listed on the board-approved delegated authority registry. That registry wasn't symbolic. It was filed, documented, and referenced during every quarterly review. Legal raised a cautious concern in a short memo. They didn't challenge him outright. They just reminded him that authority changes required formal board action. Whitmore waved it off during a leadership call. It's paperwork, he said, not a religion. The room stayed quiet again. Speed over structure, optics over obligation. What he either didn't know or didn't care about was that the quarterly internal audit had already been scheduled weeks earlier. It was set to begin in 3 days. 3 days passed exactly as scheduled. And I did nothing. I didn't send warning emails. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't attempt to clarify anything for anyone. Control, I've learned, is sometimes exercised through restraint. The quarterly internal audit had been on the calendar long before I was terminated. And unlike executives, calendars don't panic. At 9 o'clock sharp, the audit team initiated its standard protocol. There was nothing dramatic about it. No accusations, no raised voices, just process. First, they reconciled signature records on all certifications issued within the previous 72 hours. Second, they cross-referenced each signature against the board-approved Delegated Authority Registry, the same registry legal had quietly referenced in their memo. Third, they verified effective dates, confirming whether any authority changes had been formally approved and documented. The system did the rest. 41% of active contracts executed during that 72-hour window carried certifications signed by an individual not listed on the approved authority schedule. The finding generated an automated classification, invalid certification risk, no emotion, no bias, just math and documentation. I received a forwarded copy of the preliminary audit summary from a former colleague who still believed in courtesy. I read it once. Slowly. The language was neutral, clinical, precise, exactly how compliance is supposed to sound. By early afternoon, the report reached Graham Whitmore. He reportedly laughed. Internal flags aren't violations. He told the executive team. It's just housekeeping. He wasn't entirely wrong. An internal flag isn't a violation. It's a signal, a question mark, a documented inconsistency waiting for governance review. What he either overlooked or underestimated was the escalation pathway embedded in the audit workflow. When certification irregularities exceed a defined materiality threshold in this case, anything above 25% exposure, the system automatically forwards the findings to the board's audit committee. 41% is not a small number. The report did not stop at his inbox. It routed, silently and without ceremony, to the audit committee of the board of directors for independent review. If you believe I was right to step back, let the audit process run, and trust documented authority instead of emotion. Leave a 1 in the comments, because when you speak up, it shows that integrity still has witnesses. The escalation did not arrive with sirens. It arrived in the form of a coverage inquiry, the morning after the audit committee received the certification report. Our professional liability insurer sent a formal request for clarification regarding signing authority on recently executed contracts. The language was polite, almost sterile, but the implication was unmistakable. They wanted confirmation that all compliance certifications had been issued by a properly authorized officer. I knew exactly why. Buried in our professional liability policy was a clause most executives never read. If material certifications are executed by an individual lacking documented authority, coverage related to those certifications may be suspended pending review, not canceled, suspended, in regulated industries. Suspension is enough. The insurer invoked what they called a temporary underwriting review. That meant risk reassessment, exposure recalculation, potential premium adjustments. It also meant that any claim tied to those 41% flagged contracts could fall into a gray zone until authority was validated. The pressure began to spread quietly across departments. Finance asked whether coverage was actually impacted. Legal asked for a copy of the Delegated Authority Registry. Investor relations wanted to know if this would require disclosure. No one wanted to use the word suspension out loud. Whitmore, however, did. This is procedural paranoia. He snapped during an executive call. Insurance companies look for excuses. That's their business model. What he failed to acknowledge was that compliance documentation was ours. Without confirmed authority alignment, the insurer had every contractual right to reassess exposure. That wasn't paranoia. That was underwriting logic. By mid-afternoon, the insurer requested a written explanation of the authority transition and any board resolutions authorizing interim certification powers. There were none. Then the second wave hit. 2 federal clients, both operating under strict regulatory frameworks, sent formal notices requesting recertification within 48 hours. Citing governance irregularities identified through routine oversight channels. 48 hours. The insurer was reviewing our coverage. The board was reviewing his authority. And now the clients were reviewing our credibility. The dominoes were no longer theoretical. Pressure rarely explodes all at once. It tightens. By the end of the second day, The practical consequence of just paperwork became measurable, because the certifications could not be reissued by a properly authorized officer immediately. $73 million in pending federal payments were placed on hold, not canceled, not disputed, suspended until documentation was cured. Finance stopped pretending this was theoretical. Cash flow projections were recalculated in real time. Treasury flagged covenant ratios. Someone quietly mentioned liquidity thresholds. The tone in executive emails shifted from confident to clipped. $73 million is not a rounding error. I wasn't in the building anymore, but former colleagues kept me informed. The CFO, who had signed in my place, was fielding calls from both clients and internal teams demanding a timeline for recertification. There wasn't one. Authority changes require formal board action, updated registry filings, and documented effective dates. None of that can be manufactured overnight without creating a second problem. Whitmore, however, attempted to create a shortcut, according to a message forwarded to me. He asked the CFO to reissue the certifications with adjusted effective dates, clean paperwork reflecting authority as intended. Legal did not hesitate this time. Backdating certification is criminal exposure, the general counsel reportedly said during a closed-door discussion. Not regulatory risk, not compliance ambiguity, criminal exposure. The room, I was told, went silent. Backdating a compliance document in a federal contract environment is not cosmetic. It implies intent. It transforms governance error into potential fraud. Even executives who prefer speed understand that line. For the first time. Whitmore's insistence met resistance that wasn't polite. Meanwhile, the withheld $73 million began to ripple outward. Vendor payments were reprioritized. Discretionary spending froze. A capital project was paused. The narrative shifted from optics to solvency. And then the final message of the day arrived. The audit committee of the board had scheduled an emergency session with Graham Whitmore for the following morning, not a review. A session at 9 o'clock sharp, by 9 the next morning. The temperature in the building had shifted from panic to procedure. I wasn't in the boardroom, but I didn't need to be. Governance leaves paper trails. And paper trails tell stories without raising their voices. The audit committee convened exactly as scheduled, joined by outside counsel and the independent auditor. This was no longer about optics. It was about documentation. Whitmore opened with confidence. I was told. He characterized my refusal to sign as intentional obstruction of operations during a material revenue event. He framed himself as decisive. He framed me as resistant. Then the chair asked for the official delegated authority registry. Not a summary, not a slide. The filed document. Someone printed it. The registry listed every executive authorized to execute compliance certifications under federal review conditions, effective dates, board approval references, signature authority scope. My name was still there. Iris Lane, Director of Contract Risk Oversight, sole authority for crisis period compliance certification. No interim amendment, no emergency resolution, no superseding vote. Whitmore's response was reportedly immediate, then updated. It was the kind of answer that works in operations. It does not work in governance. Outside counsel intervened. Calm and precise. Authority changes are not retroactive. He said, any certification executed prior to formal amendment remains subject to the authority structure in place at the time. That sentence did more damage than any accusation. Retroactivity would not cure the 41% exposure. It would only document awareness after the fact. The discussion shifted from process to motive. If I was the only authorized signatory, and I had documented compliance concerns before being terminated, the sequence mattered. Refusal. Email, termination, replacement signature. One committee member reportedly asked a single question. Was Ms. Lane terminated for exercising documented compliance discretion? Silence answers more than words sometimes do. The meeting extended past its scheduled hour. When it ended, no public statement was issued, no vote announced. but the audit committee formally requested an independent review into whether my termination constituted retaliation for performing fiduciary compliance duties. It was no longer about speed versus process. It was about intent. Power has a way of reversing direction when documentation enters the room. By the afternoon following the audit committee session, the conversation shifted from certification errors to employment law. The independent counsel retained by the board requested a full timeline of events, my written compliance objection, the refusal to sign, the termination decision, and the interim certification executed afterward. Timelines don't argue. They align. 27 minutes before my badge access was disabled, I had sent a documented email to the executive team and legal. It was brief, factual, and direct. Certification cannot proceed without remediation of the Payment Acceleration Clause to ensure federal compliance. No emotion, no accusation, just a statement of professional judgment. Under federal whistleblower protection statutes, employees are shielded when refusing to participate in conduct they reasonably believe violates regulatory standards. Refusal to certify inaccurate compliance documentation falls squarely within that framework. I knew that when I wrote the email. I also knew it might cost me my job. What I did not know was how quickly that sequence would matter. Independent counsel reportedly warned the committee that if my termination was linked to my documented compliance objection, the company could face a retaliation claim, not an internal grievance, a protected disclosure issue, and in regulated federal contracting. Retaliation allegations can trigger external review. The language changed inside the building. It was no longer about operational authority. It was about exposure. Whitmore maintained that I had disrupted revenue strategy, but the timestamp undermined that narrative. The objection came first. The termination followed. Sequence is power. By late afternoon, the phrase certification irregularities appeared in a brief industry blog post citing unnamed sources. Markets rarely wait for formal findings. Investors respond to uncertainty, not verdicts, by closing bell. The company's stock had fallen 11%. No official conclusion had been reached. No regulator had announced action, but the market had read the pattern. And patterns, once visible, are difficult to contain. The collapse did not arrive as a single explosion. It unfolded in layers, precise and clinical. Within 48 hours of the market drop, 3 major federal clients formally suspended renewal discussions pending completion of certification review. Not termination suspension. In government contracting, suspension is the polite version of distrust. At the same time, the internal audit findings escalated into formal remediation review. 41% of recently executed contracts were flagged for re-examination. Each required document validation, authority confirmation, and in some cases, client-side recertification. Legal teams on both sides began scheduling calls. The insurer had not lifted its temporary underwriting review. Coverage remained technically active, but conditional. No written reinstatement, no reassurance, just silence. Inside the company, silence is expensive. I received a call from an unfamiliar number late that afternoon. I recognized the pause before he spoke. "Iris," Graham said. Tone measured now, almost conciliatory. "Let's resolve this quietly." There was no apology in his voice, only containment. "I don't want this escalating further," he continued. "We can correct the paperwork, reinstate authority, move forward." I let him finish. "Compliance isn't personal," I replied. "It's documented." There was a brief exhale on the other end. He wanted flexibility. I offered accuracy. The issue was no longer my employment. It was governance integrity. Certifications had been executed without proper authority. Audit flags had triggered board review. Insurance exposure had surfaced. Clients had paused renewals. These were not interpersonal disputes. They were structural consequences. He shifted tactics. "You know this could damage the company long term." The implication was clear: cooperate for stability. "I didn't create the instability," I said calmly. "I identified it." We ended the call without agreement. The next morning, The board issued an internal announcement. It was brief and carefully worded. Effective immediately, Graham Whitmore's executive authority was temporarily suspended pending completion of the independent review. Not terminated, suspended. Operational control transferred to the chief operating officer under board supervision. No celebration followed. No dramatic confrontation. Just another layer falling into place. Justice rarely sounds dramatic when it finally arrives. It reads like minutes from a meeting, 2 weeks after Whitmore's authority was suspended. The board released its formal findings to senior leadership and key stakeholders. The language was restrained, almost antiseptic. But the conclusions were clear. First, Graham Whitmore had breached fiduciary governance obligations by authorizing compliance certifications outside the documented delegated authority framework. Second, he had disregarded explicit legal advisories warning against unauthorized certification execution and retroactive correction attempts. Third, he had executed federal compliance confirmations without proper authority during a material contractual event. No emotional adjectives, no grand statements, just facts tied to documentation. The public announcement followed later that afternoon. Whitmore resigned for personal reasons. That phrase has a particular tone in corporate America. It signals departure without litigation, at least publicly. Internally, it was less ambiguous. His unvested equity awards were frozen pending final compensation review. Performance bonuses tied to the quarter were suspended. The board initiated a clawback assessment under executive accountability provisions. Governance committees do not shout, they document. The market responded cautiously but positively. Stability, even after disruption, carries value. I did not celebrate. The story had never been about a personality clash. It had been about authority, responsibility, and the cost of ignoring structure. Whitmore had mistaken speed for leadership. The system had corrected that miscalculation. 3 days after the resignation announcement, I received a call not from him, but from the chair of the board. The tone was direct. "We would like to discuss reinstating your role," she said, "and restructuring the delegated authority system to prevent concentration risk going forward." There was no flattery, no apology phrased as diplomacy, just recognition. The request was not simply for my return, it was for institutional repair. I understood what that meant. Authority had to be redistributed. Certification workflows needed redundancy without dilution. Governance training required reinforcement at the executive level. The gatekeeper was no longer an obstacle. It was now a requirement. And this time, the board was the one asking me to rebuild it. Restoration is quieter than collapse. When I walked back into the building for the restructuring session, there were no dramatic apologies waiting for me, no standing ovation, just a long table, updated governance documents, and a board that finally understood what had been at stake. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing theatrical about what had happened. Systems fail when people treat them as optional. Systems recover when accountability becomes non-negotiable. During the meeting, after the revised delegated authority framework was presented, I spoke only once. Speed doesn't replace accountability. No one argued. The new structure distributed certification authority across defined roles, required dual validation during federal review periods, and embedded automatic escalation triggers that could not be overridden by a single executive. Transparency replaced assumption. Documentation replaced personality. Compliance was no longer described as friction. It was described as infrastructure. Over the following weeks, the 41% of flagged contracts were systematically reviewed and recertified under proper authority. Clients resumed renewals. Insurance coverage was formally reaffirmed in writing. Liquidity stabilized. Whitmore left without ceremony. No farewell memo, no leadership podcast quote, just an exit processed through human resources. I never needed him publicly disgraced. The record was enough. Justice did not arrive with shouting. It arrived with documentation aligned to policy. It arrived with signatures executed by the right authority, on the right date, for the right reason, and in the end. That was all it needed to be. What this experience taught me is simple, But not easy integrity rarely feels powerful in the moment. It feels isolating. It feels inconvenient. It feels like you're the only one slowing down a room full of urgency. But documentation outlasts ego. Process outlasts personality. And when you choose to stand on principle instead of pressure, you may lose position for a season, but you protect something far bigger than a title. I didn't win because I argued louder. I didn't win because I exposed anyone. I won because I wrote things down, followed policy, and refused to sign what I knew was wrong. That's not dramatic. It's disciplined. If you were in that room, with revenue on the line and everyone staring at you, what would you have done? Would you have signed and hoped nothing surfaced? Or would you have absorbed the cost and trusted the record? And before you go, tell me, where are you listening from today? Different states, different countries, different industries, but the pressure to compromise looks surprisingly similar everywhere. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. One subscription helps this message reach someone who might be sitting in their own boardroom, wondering if integrity is worth the risk. A like or a share could push this video towards someone who needs the reminder that doing the right thing is not naive, it's necessary. Your click isn't small, it's leverage. And sometimes, leverage changes outcomes. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.